How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday. Yom Hamishi. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Upgraded a part of the system here, the computer that I monitor. So far, everything going well. Hopefully no issues there. Okay, who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Renee in Indiana, Guy in Ohio, Bella in Florida, Lorraine in Texas, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Gail in Kansas City, Shandora in the Bronx, Frank in San Pedro, Ella in Southern California, Alan in New York City, Norm, I forget where you are, Norm, but you made it. Welcome. And Bill Knoxwood. Yes, just so. Okay, double daf. Let's get to it. We're opening Mishna number 2 here in chapter 3 of Tractate Makkos, the 25th volume of the Talmud. Chapter 3, the third and final chapter of this short tractate, is all about lashes. When do they apply? And as we've seen, there's a lot of nuance and complexity because the Torah does not always spell out when lashes apply. But generally, so far, the principles that we have in place are it's for violating a negative commandment, thou shalt not do such and such, and the person did it. And in the absence of a positive mitzvah, thou shalt do the following in order to correct that which you shouldn't have done when you violated the negative commandment. In the absence of that kind of a positive mitzvah, lashes may apply, again, if there was witnesses and warning. But so often, we're not talking about whether lashes are really going to be administered. More, is this the kind of prohibition for whose violation, if there was a warning and witnesses, there would be lashes. And that seems to be negative commandments that don't have a positive correction associated with them, at least afterward. If the positive mitzvah that's associated with it is stated before, then there might be lashes. Okay, let's look at some more cases with more nuance. Mishnah 2 on page 17a. In the case of a priest, okay, Kohen, who eats first fruits before the one who brought the fruits to the temple recited over those fruits the Torah verses that he is obligated to recite, right? So bikkurim, an obligation that when the temple is standing in Jerusalem and we go for the pilgrimage festivals, and one brings the first fruits So this is really Sukkot when this is happening. And it could be Pesach, but it's really Purim. I'm sorry, it's really Sukkot. So you bring these first fruits, and then there's verses in the Torah that one who brings first fruits from his farm, right, the first and choicest fruits that he's going to bring up to Jerusalem, and he says, I have done the following things. It's just he recites literal verses from the Torah. Which includes some lines that are quoted in the Haggadah, like my father was a wandering Aramean. But basically, I've done my best to fulfill your will, O Lord our God, and now I have brought these fruits. And those fruits are also laid at the temple, and there's like a beautiful, so many people are bringing first fruits, and you really see the bounty of the land of Israel laid out at the temple. Plus, the people who live nearby bring all kinds of grapes, and the whole Jerusalem would be decorated with this. But then the first fruits specifically are done at the Holy Temple, and then a priest may eat of them. So the first thing we're learning is that if a priest eats these first fruits before the person who brought them recites these verses, he'll be flogged. And it turns out that's not the law. This is one of those rare cases where what's stated in the Mishnah anonymously turns out to not be the halakha, is not the law, as we shall see. But the Mishnah is going to go on and give other cases where flogging would apply for violating these kinds of prohibitions. The next case, and one who ate offerings of the most sacred order outside the curtains surrounding the tabernacle courtyard. Now, offerings of the most sacred order, that's like a sin offering, a portion of which is eaten. But who eats it? Only a priest. Only a priest is ever able to eat this. But there are conditions even for the priest to eat those portions of the sin offering that are available for eating, which only goes to the priest. But even they have to eat it in the courtyard of the Holy Temple. They can't eat it outside the temple. And if they eat it outside the temple, then they would be flogged. Again, warning, etc. Other cases, and one who ate offerings of lesser sanctity. This would be peace offerings and thanksgiving offerings. Or second tithe, maaser sheini, outside the wall of Jerusalem. This is something that non-priests can eat, but they can only eat it within the walls of Jerusalem. And also one who breaks the bone of a ritually pure Pesach, the Paschal offering, the lamb or the kid goat. That's eaten on Passover night, but we're told, you can't break a bone in it. You have to roast it and not boil it or bake it, and it has to all be eaten that night, as we've talked about before. So if you break the bone, then you would be subject to flogging. In all these cases, he is flogged with 40 lashes. But one who leaves the flesh of the ritually pure Paschal offering until the morning of the 15th of Nisan, right, the morning after Passover night, and one who breaks a bone of a ritually impure Pesach, a Pesach Tameh, he is not flogged with 40 lashes because already it was disqualified from being eaten. With regard to one who takes the mother bird with her fledglings, thereby violating the Torah prohibition from Deuteronomy 22, verses 6 and 7, which said, "You shall not take the mother with her fledglings. You shall send the mother and the fledglings you may take for yourself." About this, Rabbi Yehuda says he is flogged for taking the mother bird and does not send the mother and does not send her away. He is flogged if he takes the mother bird rather than sending her away, as the Torah commands. But the rabbis say, right, the majority who overrule Rabbi Yehuda, he sends the mother. That's the cure. Okay, he didn't send, but now he does send, and he is not flogged, as this is the principle with regard to any prohibition that entails a command to arise and perform a positive mitzvah. He is not liable to receive lashes even for the negative prohibition that's associated with it. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that a priest who eats first fruits before the one who brought the fruits to the temple recited the accompanying Torah verses is liable to receive lashes. And with regard to this statement, Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says this is the statement of Rabbi Akiva, whose statements are often cited in the Mishnah unattributed. But the rabbis say, right? So even though it's Rabbi Akiva uttering an unattributed halacha in this Mishnah, Nevertheless, we don't follow it because the majority overruled Rabbi Akiva. The rabbis say, with regard to first fruits, the lack of placement of them alongside the altar invalidates them, and then they may not be eaten. But the lack of recitation of the accompanying Torah verses does not invalidate them. And if one placed them and did not recite the accompanying verses, the priest who eats them is not flogged. The verses should have been recited. The priest should have waited until the verses were recited. But if he didn't, he ate fruit that was placed properly alongside the altar, and the verses were never recited, the priest is not flogged for that. And the Gemara suggests, and let Rabbi Yochanan say, this statement in the Mishnah is the unattributed statement of Rabbi Shimon, who stated this law explicitly, rather than attributing this statement to Rabbi Akiva, whose statement was not explicit. And the Gemara answers, well, this teaches us that although he did not say so explicitly, Rabbi Akiva holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. So you may wonder, what is the statement of Rabbi Shimon? It is as it is taught in a baraisa with regard to food items that may not be eaten outside the walls of Jerusalem. It is written, quote, you may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain, or of your wine, or of your oil, or the firstborn of your herd or your flock, nor any of your vows that you vow, nor your gift offerings, nor the donation of your hand. Deuteronomy 12:17. And the sages explain that with regard to the phrase, nor the donation of your hand, terumas, these are first fruits. So Rabbi Shimon said, what does this phrase come to teach us? If it is to teach us the prohibition to eat the first fruits outside the wall of Jerusalem, there is no need for such a verse, as it may be derived by means of a kal v'chomer inference from the lenient case of second tithe, right? Maaser sheini, when the temple was standing in Jerusalem, and a farmer harvested his produce, first 2% to a priest, that's teruma. Next 10% to a Levite, that's maaser or tithe. Next 10%, second tithe, maaser sheini. In 4 of the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle, that is second tithe, and the person uses it so that he has what to eat when he goes up to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals. Either he literally carries that produce with him, or he deconsecrates it by selling it, and the money that he receives for selling that second tithe, that money is consecrated. He sets that money aside. He can only use that money when he goes up to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festival to buy food and drink while he's in Jerusalem making the pilgrimage. That's maaser sheini, second tithe. And you may only eat it or only use that money to purchase food that you will eat in Jerusalem, within the walls of Jerusalem during the pilgrimage festival. So why is that relevant here? Because kal v'chomer inference from the lenient case of maaser sheini. If with regard to the lenient case of maaser sheini, one who eats that second tithe food outside the walls of Jerusalem is flogged, then with regard to bikkurim, first fruits, all the more so is it not clear that he is flogged, right? Because bikkurim not just has to be eaten within the walls of Jerusalem, it has to be eaten within the walls of the Holy Temple itself. So obviously, it's going to have more stringent laws associated with it. And if a priest would be flogged for eating maaser sheini, or any person would be flogged for eating maaser sheini outside the walls of Jerusalem, then a priest would be flogged for eating first fruits outside the walls of the temple, or when it wasn't placed properly, right? Because it's a more stringencies associated with it. So rather, the verse comes to teach only with regard to a priest who partakes of bikkurim before the person who brought the fruits to the temple recited the accompanying Torah verses over them, teaching that he is flogged, right? This would be Rabbi Akiva's view, which we see got from Rabbi Shimon, even though it's the minority view. And the baraisa continues, nor your gift offerings. This is a thanks offering or a peace offering that one donates voluntarily. And Rabbi Shimon says, what does this phrase come to teach us? If it is to teach us that it is prohibited to eat a thanks offering or a peace offering outside the wall of Jerusalem, there's no need for such a verse. We could have derived it by kal v'chomer inference from the case of second tithe produce, maaser sheini. for whose consumption outside the wall one is flogged, despite the fact that it is not an offering at all, right? Second tithe is not an offering, but the shalamim, the peace offerings, or the toda, the thanks offering, these are actual offerings. Of course, they have to be eaten within the walls of Jerusalem. So therefore, since we didn't need this verse to teach us this, rather the verse comes to teach only with regard to one who partakes of a thanks offering or a peace offering before the sprinkling of its blood on the altar, before the consumption of its flesh is permitted, that he is flogged, right? Because when you bring a peace offering or a thanks offering, you slaughter it in the temple courtyard, collect some of its blood, that gets sprinkled on the Mizbeach, the altar in the Holy Temple, and then its owner can take it, to the barbecue site outside the Temple Mount where he's going to eat it, enjoy it with his family. But some of that blood had to be sprinkled on the altar before the rest of the peace or thanks offering is permitted for consumption. And if he ate it before that, he's subject to flogging if there were witnesses and warning. The Baraisa continues, or the firstborn, Bechor. So when you have certain kinds of kosher animals, the firstborn male, if the firstborn of a female, sheep, for example, is a male, then that firstborn, that is an offering. It's consecrated from as soon as it emerges from the womb. It needs to be brought as an offering. This is the Bechor, the firstborn. Rabbi Shimon says, what does this verse come to teach us? If it is to teach us that it is prohibited to eat a firstborn animal outside the wall of Jerusalem, we don't need such a verse, as it may be derived by means of the kal v'chomer inference from the case of second tithe produce, maaser sheini. If it is to teach that it is prohibited to eat a firstborn animal before sprinkling the blood, we can derive that by means of the kal v'chomer from the thanks offering and the peace offering. So rather, this verse comes to teach us only with regard to a non-priest who partakes of the flesh of a firstborn, even after the sprinkling of its blood, that he is flogged. And the Baraisa continues, of your herd or of your flock, this is a sin offering and a guilt offering, offerings of the highest sanctity, which are offerings of the most sacred order, which may be eaten only within the temple courtyard by priests. Rabbi Shimon says, what does this verse come to teach us? If it is to teach us that it is prohibited to eat sin offerings and guilt offerings outside the wall, there's no need for such a verse, as it may be derived by the kal v'chomer inference from the case of maaser sheini. If it is to teach us that it's prohibited to eat a sin offering and a guilt offering before sprinkling its blood, that may be derived by the kal v'chomer inference from the case of the thanks offering and the peace offering. If it is to teach us that it is prohibited for a non-priest to eat a sin offering and a guilt offering after the sprinkling of its blood, we could have derived that by kal v'chomer inference from the case of the firstborn, the Bechor. So rather, this verse comes to teach us only with regard to one who partakes of the flesh of a sin offering or a guilt offering even after the sprinkling of the blood, which is the correct time to partake of it, but he partakes of it outside the curtain surrounding the tabernacle courtyard or outside the temple courtyard, that he is flogged. And the Baraisa continues, your vows, this is the burnt offering, which is an offering of the most sacred order, but you don't need any of it. It is entirely consumed on the altar, and it is brought as a gift offering, not as an obligation. It's voluntary. So Rabbi Shimon says, what does this verse come to teach us? And here we go. If it is to teach us that it is prohibited to eat a burnt offering outside the wall of Jerusalem, no need. We could derive a kal v'chomer from the case of maaser sheini. If it is to teach us that it's prohibited to eat a burnt offering before the sprinkling of the blood, we could derive that kal v'chomer from the case of the thanks offering and the peace offering, which are offerings of lesser sanctity. If it is to teach us that it's prohibited for a non-priest to eat a sin offering or a guilt offering after the sprinkling of the blood, it may be derived by the kal v'chomer from the case of the Bechor. If it is to teach that it is prohibited to eat a burnt offering outside the curtain surrounding the tabernacle courtyard or outside the temple courtyard itself, there's the kal v'chomer inference from a sin offering and a guilt offering. Therefore, the verse comes to teach us only with regard to one who partakes of the flesh of a burnt offering after the sprinkling, even inside the courtyard, that he is flogged, because we don't eat any part of a burnt offering. Now we're on page 17b. Rava says, with regard to Rabbi Shimon's statement that we just read, this long statement of derivations, with regard to anyone whose mother is bearing a child who is like Rabbi Shimon, she should bear that child. And if not, it is preferable that she does not bear him at all. This is absolutely hyperbolic. It's a sort of very, unusual way to give a wonderful compliment, right? Rabbi was so impressed by Rabbi Shimon's statement that he praised him and characterized him as the model of a wise man, right? All humans should be like Rabbi Shimon, is what Rava is saying. And then Rava added, and I say this even though there is a refutation for each and every one of his conclusions. This is wonderful, right? This is Chazal, our sages of blessed memory, ribbing each other and saying, you are the wisest man on earth, but you're wrong. And here's why. We're on page 17b. So, what is the stringency of first fruits, bikkurim, vis-a-vis second tithe produce? Right? In what way are first fruits more stringent, the law of bikkurim more stringent than the law of maaser sheini? It is that bikkurim are forbidden to non-priests. Only Kohanim, only Kohens eat bikkurim. It is that first fruits are forbidden to non-priests, but non-priests, right? Non-priests are permitted to eat maaser sheini. All Jews can eat maaser sheini as long as they're in Jerusalem. Well, this can be refuted. On the contrary, second tithe, right? Maaser sheini, the law of maaser sheini is more stringent than the law of bikkurim, right? So bikkurim is more stringent than maaser sheini, in that only priests can eat bikkurim. But maaser sheini is more stringent than bikkurim in that maaser sheini is forbidden to an acute mourner, right? Somebody who lost a family member on the same day before the family member has been buried. This is an acute mourner, an onain, and he is not allowed to eat maaser sheini in that condition. Okay. And so that's a stringency of maaser sheini, where that law is actually more stringent than the law of bikkurim. And what is the stringency of shalamim and todos, right? How to make that a plural? At any rate, what is the stringency of thanks offerings and peace offerings, as compared to maaser sheini? It is that thanks offerings and peace offerings require the placement of blood and sacrificial portions upon the altar. Well, this can be refuted, meaning that doesn't mean that all around those offerings all their laws are more stringent than the laws of maaser sheini, because maaser sheini is more stringent than thanks offerings and peace offerings in the sense that the redemption of maaser sheini requires money minted into a coin. A disqualified thanks offering or peace offering, like other disqualified offerings, may be redeemed with any object of equal value. Maaser sheini, if you're going to deconsecrate it onto something else, it has to be coins, minted coins, which are good traveling money to take up to Jerusalem. You can't exchange it for a sheep and then exchange the sheep for a coin later. You can only exchange maaser sheini for minted coins. And what is the stringency of a bechor offering vis-a-vis a thanks offering or a peace offering? It is that the sanctity of the firstborn takes effect from the womb, while the other offerings are only become consecrated when their owners consecrate them. But this can be refuted in the sense that these other offerings have stringencies that the bechor doesn't have. On the contrary, a thanks offering and a peace offering are more stringent in that they require semicha, that the owner places hands on the head of the offering before its sacrifice, and they are accompanied by libations and the waving of the breast and the thigh, which is not the case when the bechor, when it is offered in the temple in Jerusalem. And what is the stringency of a sin offering and a guilt offering vis-a-vis a firstborn offering? It is that a sin offering and a guilt offering are offerings of the most sacred order. But this also can be refuted. On the contrary, a firstborn offering is more stringent in that its sanctity takes effect from the womb, not by the consecration of its owner. And what is the stringency of the burnt offering vis-a-vis a sin offering and a And what is the stringency of a burnt offering vis-a-vis a sin offering and a guilt offering? It is that it is burnt in its entirety upon the altar and no part of it is given to priests. Therefore, the burnt offering is more stringent, right? Wrong. That can be refuted as, on the contrary, the sin offering, the guilt offering are more stringent in that they atone for one's sins, and a burnt offering is only brought as a voluntary gift. And all these matters listed in the Baraisa are more stringent than the burnt offering because there are two consumptions with regard to each of these matters, as they are consumed upon the altar and consumed by their owner and the priests, whereas the burnt offering is consumed in its entirety upon the altar. So the Gemara asks, so rather, what is the meaning of this statement of praise? Right? So if Rava now just proved that everything that Rabbi Shimon said was wrong, why did he start by praising him and saying all people should be like Rabbi Shimon? Right? When he said anyone whose mother is bearing a child like Rabbi Shimon, she should bear that child, and if not, it's better than not to bear him at all. Ultimately, all his derivations can be refuted. So the Gemara answers the praise is based on the fact that in order to arrive at what he himself holds, he transposes the verse and interprets it. Rabbi Shimon does not interpret the verse from beginning to end. Rather, he begins with the final case of the first fruits in order to arrive at the desired conclusion, and Rava was impressed with Rabbi Shimon's interpretation. Now, the Gemara asks with regard to Rabbi Shimon, who derived prohibitions not written in the Torah by means of kal v'chomer inferences. Now, we've already seen that if you're going to say that these are flogging offenses, right, flogging offenses, there's a problem because we already said that a person cannot be flogged for violating a negative prohibition that is not written explicitly in the Torah, but rather is derived by kal v'chomer inference. So according to Rabbi Shimon, all these prohibitions would be derived by kal v'chomer inferences. So even if the law was according to Rabbi Shimon, how could he say that people would be flogged if the prohibitions are not explicit? Does one derive a prohibition from a kal v'chomer inference? But even according to the one who says that if there is a prohibition written explicitly in the Torah, one administers a punishment based on a kal v'chomer inference, nevertheless, one does not derive a prohibition from a kal v'chomer inference. And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Shimon does not derive prohibitions for which one is flogged from those inferences. Rather, he derives a mere prohibition. He figures out what the justification for flogging when they're violated in a different way. It's a very interesting case where as we're going to see, the prohibition is explicit in the Torah. Rabbi Shimon is just showing you could have derived it with a kal v'chomer, and that helps us understand it. But no, the prohibitions are there. It's just not so obvious. So the Gemara asks, but doesn't Rava say, with regard to a non-priest who ate the flesh of a burnt offering before sprinkling its blood outside the walls, according to Rabbi Shimon, he is flogged with 5 sets of lashes, one because he's a non-priest, one for eating a burnt offering, one for eating the flesh of an offering before its blood was sprinkled, another for eating offerings of the most sacred order outside the temple courtyard, and yet another for eating sacrificial food outside of Jerusalem. 5 sets of lashes for one act of eating. Apparently, Rabbi Shimon holds that these are actual prohibitions for which one is flogged. And the Gemara answers, it does not mean that one is actually flogged. Rather, it means that there are 5 prohibitions. So the Gemara asks, okay, but didn't we learn in the Mishna, and these are the people who are flogged by Torah law? Among them is a priest who eats first fruits before the recitation of the accompanying Torah verses. And the Gemara established that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, that Rabbi Akiva agrees with. Okay, so how are we going to flog based on that? Now we're on page 18a. Rather, the derivation is that the entire verse beginning, you may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain, at Deuteronomy 12:17, is a superfluous verse. After all, it is already written in Deuteronomy 12:6 and 7, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices and your tithes and the donation of your hand and your vows and your gift offerings and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock, and there you shall eat before the Lord your God. All the items that must be eaten within the walls of Jerusalem have already been enumerated. And if the Torah enumerates them again, why? It already said it. If it repeats it, it's to teach us something new. So let the merciful one write simply, you may not eat them the second time in general terms, which would constitute a prohibition for which one would be liable to receive lashes for each of the cases enumerated. Why does the merciful one again specifically enumerate and detail each one of them? Rather, this repetition serves to designate additional prohibitions for each and every one of those cases enumerated in the latter verse. And the prohibition is derived not by means of a kal v'chomer inference, rather it is derived from the superfluous verse, the repetition. Rabbi Shimon derives by means of the kal v'chomer inferences the additional prohibition that is already in effect in each of these cases because the law was repeated to teach something new. Now, with regard to the matter itself, Rava says, with regard to a non-priest who ate the flesh of a burnt offering before sprinkling its blood outside the walls, according to Rabbi Shimon, he is flogged with 5 sets of lashes. And the Gemara suggests, and let him also be flogged for violating the prohibition, quote, and a non-priest may not eat as they are sacred. And the Gemara explains this matter, prohibiting a non-priest from eating consecrated food, applies only in a case where the food is fit for consumption by priests. Here, where the food is not fit for consumption by the priests either, as it is not permitted for anyone to partake of burnt offerings, there is no specific prohibition that applies to a non-priest. So the Gemara suggests, and let him also be flogged for violating the prohibition, quote, and any flesh torn of animals in the field you shall not eat. Right? In other words, it was not slaughtered in a kosher manner, even though it's a kosher animal. From Exodus 22:30. Now, from the term in the field, a general law is derived. Once the flesh emerged outside its partition and is in the field, for example, sacrificial meat that was taken outside the tabernacle curtains that demarcate the courtyard, then there is a prohibition and the flesh is forbidden. And the Gemara explains this matter that the prohibition against eating sacrificial flesh outside the partition of the temple courtyard applies only in the case where the flesh is fit for consumption inside the courtyard. Here, in the case of a burnt offering, can it ever be eaten? No, the flesh is not fit for consumption inside the courtyard either, as it is not permitted for anyone to partake of a burnt offering. Therefore, there is no specific prohibition that applies to a non-priest eating it anywhere, whether in the courtyard or outside the courtyard. So we don't add another set of lashes according to that reasoning. Now the Gemara suggests, and let him also be flogged in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. As Rabbi Eliezer says that when it is stated with regard to leftover flesh and loaves from the inauguration offerings, it shall not be eaten because it is sacred, and now we're on page 18b, it is derived that with regard to any item that is sacrificial and disqualified for whatever reason, the verse comes to impose a prohibition upon its consumption. And the Gemara explains, this matter applies only in a case where, before its disqualification, it was fit. Here it is a case where, before its disqualification, it was not fit either. And therefore, we don't add another prohibition nor another set of lashes. Now the Gemara suggests, well, what about let him also be flogged in accordance with the other statement of Rabbi Eliezer? As it is taught in Baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer says, with regard to any item that is included in the commandment, it shall be burned in its entirety, from Leviticus 6:16. Sounds like the burnt offering. The verse serves to impose a prohibition upon its consumption. If it is commanded to burn it entirely, that establishes a prohibition against eating any of it. As it is written, it shall be burned in its entirety, comma, it shall not be eaten, in Leviticus 6:16. So the Gemara explains, yes, it is indeed so that according to Rabbi Shimon, one is flogged for violating this prohibition as well. And Rava is saying that from this verse, he is interpreting that it is derived that one is flogged with 5 sets of lashes according to Rabbi Shimon. New subject. Rav Gidel says that Rav says a statement about a priest, a Kohen, and another statement about a non-priest. Before proceeding, the Gemara provides a mnemonic for these statements, Kaf, Vav, Zayin, Aleph, and Rav says, a priest who ate a sin offering or a guilt offering before sprinkling their blood on the altar is flogged. Right? He did something that is not permitted to do. What is the reason that he is flogged? It is, as the verse states, with regard to the inauguration offerings, whose halachic status was like that of sin offerings and guilt offerings, in that it was permitted only for the priests to partake of their flesh, and they shall eat them, that which they were atoned. Exodus 29:33, from which it is inferred, after atonement, yes, they may eat the flesh of these offerings. Before atonement, no, they may not eat of it. And in Rav's opinion, the status of a prohibition that stems from a positive commandment is that of a prohibition for which one is flogged. Not a majority opinion there. Rava raises an objection based on the verse. And every beast that splits the hoof and has the hoof cloven in two and chews the cud among the animals, that may you eat. Right? So this is naming what are the kosher mammals. The kosher mammals have these conditions, right? A beast with a split hoof, a split hoof, and that hoof is cloven in two, not in more or less than two, right? So this is going to include the cow, and it's also going to include other animals like a deer. A deer is a kosher animal if it's kosher for eating if it's slaughtered in a kosher manner, even though it is a non-domesticated animal. But it has to have the cloven hoof and chews its cud, right? So that you may eat. Now, is that a commandment in the positive sense, or is that a negative prohibition? It's saying only these animals you may eat. Now, we can infer, well, therefore you can't eat a pig, right? Or therefore you cannot eat a camel. Or therefore you cannot eat a cougar because those animals don't satisfy these conditions. So is that a positive mitzvah or a negative prohibition? And if you then eat that non-kosher animal, are you flogged for it because you violated a negative prohibition? Or are you not flogged because you failed to perform a positive commandment? Let's see. Right, so according to this, every beast that splits the hoof and has the hoof cloven in two and chews the cud among the animals, that may you eat. From which a prohibition may be inferred. That may you eat. But there is not any other animal that you may eat. So the Torah prohibits the flesh. The Torah prohibits eating the flesh of any animal that lacks the indicators that it is a kosher animal. And if it is, as you say, that an inference from a positive mitzvah entails a prohibition, why do I need the following verse? Quote, this you may not eat in Deuteronomy 14:7. Right? If we can assume the negative prohibition from a positive, when it said these are the only animals that you may eat, right? Then why did it add the words, of other stuff, this you may not eat? It must be that we can't derive the negative prohibition from the positive commandment. Why don't we read the following verse? This you may not eat in Deuteronomy 14:7. As it was already inferred from the mitzvah. So rather, apparently, the status of a prohibition that stems from a positive mitzvah is that of a positive mitzvah. It has the status of a positive mitzvah, and one is not liable to receive lashes for its violation. So, rather, if it was stated, this is what was stated. Rav Giddel says that Rav says, a non-priest who ate a sin offering or a guilt offering before its sprinkling of their blood is exempt from receiving lashes. What is the reason for this? It is, as the verse states, and they shall eat them, that which they were atoned, and a non-priest may not eat, as they are sacred. And it is expounded as follows. Anywhere that we read concerning it, and they shall eat them, that which they were atoned, we read concerning it, and the non-priest may not eat this sacrificial food. But anywhere that we do not read concerning it, and they shall eat them that which they were atoned. For example, in this case, where it is prohibited for priests to partake of the flesh of the offerings before the sprinkling of their blood, we do not read concerning it, and a non-priest may not eat, and therefore we don't have the negative mitzvah that would trigger lashes. So the Gemara resumes a discussion of the law that was mentioned in the Mishna, Mishna number 2 here in chapter 3, with regard to the Torah verses that one recites when he brings bikkurim, the first fruits, to the temple. Rabbi Elazar says that Rabbi Hoshaya says, with regard to first fruits, the lack of placement alongside the altar invalidates them, and they may not be eaten by the priest. But the lack of recitation of the accompanying verses does not invalidate them. And that is the law. So the Gemara asks, and did Rabbi Elazar say that? But doesn't Rabbi Elazar say that Rabbi Hoshaya says if one set aside first fruits before the festival of Sukkot and the festival elapsed over them while they remain in his possession, he set aside first fruits, but something came up and he didn't bring them to Jerusalem. Then what do you do with them? They shall be left to decay, as they cannot be rendered fit for consumption. He didn't bring them up to Jerusalem. He didn't lay them alongside the altar. He obviously didn't recite the verses. They're not going to be fit for consumption by anybody. They're just left to decay. So what? Is it not that they cannot be rendered fit due to the fact that he can no longer recite the Torah verses over them, as one may recite those Torah verses only until Sukkot? And if it enters your mind to say that the lack of recitation does not invalidate them, why must they be left to decay? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Elazar holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Zera. As Rabbi Zera says, a principle with regard to a meal offering that applies in other areas as well. For any measure of flour that is suitable for mixing with oil in a meal offering, the lack of mixing does not invalidate the meal offering. Even though there is a mitzvah, a commandment, to mix the oil and the flour ab initio, the meal offering is fit for sacrifice even if the oil and the flour are not mixed. And for any measure of flour that is not suitable for mixing with oil in a meal offering, the lack of mixing invalidates the meal offering. Here too, although failure to recite the Torah verses does not invalidate the first fruits for consumption by the priest, that is referring only to when reciting the portion is possible. After Sukkot, when it is no longer possible to recite the portion, failure to recite the Torah verses invalidates the first fruits. Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov teaches this law that was cited in the name of Rabbi Elazar as the statement of Rabbi Asi. As the statement that Rabbi Asi says, that Rabbi Yochanan says. And as a result, an apparent contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yochanan and another statement of Rabbi Yochanan is a difficulty for him. Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov asks, and did Rabbi Yochanan say that with regard to first fruits, the lack of placement alongside the altar invalidates them and they may not be eaten, while the lack of recitation of the accompanying Torah verses does not invalidate them? But didn't Rabbi Asi raise a dilemma before Rabbi Yochanan with regard to first fruits? From when is it permitted for priests to partake of them? And Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Asi, it is permitted for the priest to partake of those first fruits that are fit for recitation of the accompanying Torah verses, from when he recites those verses over them, and those first fruits that are not fit for recitation of the Torah verses are permitted once they entered inside the temple. So apparently, Rabbi Yochanan holds that the first fruits that are not fit for recitation are not invalidated. In addition, he did not mention placement of the first fruits at all, indicating that the lack of their placement alongside the altar does not invalidate them for consumption by the priest. And the Gemara notes the apparent contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to recitation and the other statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to yet recitation is difficult. And the apparent contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to placement alongside the altar and the other statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to placement alongside the altar is a difficulty. What are we going to do with these two apparent contradictions among earlier and later statements of Rabbi Yochanan? So the Gemara answers the apparent contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to recitation and the other statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to recitation is not difficult. As this statement that when recitation is impossible, lack of recitation invalidates the bikkurim, this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon that was cited in our Mishna. And that statement, which states that when recitation is impossible, lack of recitation does not invalidate the bikkurim, this is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who overruled Rabbi Shimon. And the apparent contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to placement alongside the altar and the other statement of Rabbi Yochanan with regard to placement alongside the altar is also not difficult. One of these statements is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and that other statement is in accordance with the majority who overrule Rabbi Yehuda. We already explored the difference between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon. So now the Gemara asks, what is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda? It is, as is taught in the Baraisa, that Rabbi Yehuda says with regard to the verse written in the portion of bikkurim, and you shall place it before the Lord your God, that the reference is not to the placement of the fruits alongside the altar. Rather, this is a reference to waving the first fruits. Do you say that this is a reference to waving? Or perhaps it is a reference only to actual placement of the first fruits? And he explains, when it states earlier, and the priest shall take the basket from your hand and place it before the altar of the Lord your God, placement alongside the altar is already stated. How do I realize the meaning of the term, and you shall place it? This is a reference to waving, which is done before an offering is brought in certain cases. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Now, the Gemara clarifies, and who is the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda? It is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse written in the portion of the first fruits, and the priest shall take the basket from your hand. Deuteronomy 26:4. This verse taught about the first fruits, that they require waving. And this is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. The Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov? And the Gemara explains, the matter is derived by means of a verbal analogy from one instance of the word hand, written with regard to the first fruits, and from another instance of the word hand, written with regard to peace offerings. It is written here with regard to first fruits, and the priest shall take the basket from your hand. And it is written with regard to the peace offering, he who offers his peace offering to God, his hands shall bring it before the fire of God, to raise it as a waving before God. So just as here in the case of first fruits, it is the priest who takes the basket in his hand and waves it, so too there in the case of the peace offering, a priest performs the waving. Just as there with regard to a peace offering, it is the owner who performs the waving, as it is written, he who offers, his hand shall bring it, so too the owner waves the first fruits. How so? How can the waving be performed by both the priest and the owner? Answer, the priest places his hands beneath the hands of the owner, and they wave the first fruits together. And that is where we'll stop for today and take a few questions. On Makkos 17 and 18. Sharon says, Shavuos, not Sukkos, for the first fruit offering. Is it? That's the earliest time, and I guess Sukkos is the last time that you could bring it. I always get confused, right? Because we always think about spring would be the time of the first offerings, and fall, like the way that the harvest, the growing season is different in the desert, where the growing season is the winter rather than the summer. But thank you, Sharon. Lucy, I am confused. It seems that people are receiving several punishments for only one action because that action violates several prohibitions. But I thought we learned before that in such cases, only one punishment could be applied for one action. So what we know is that where there's two punishments for the same action, we only do the heavier punishment. That's why you don't get, lashes, because we're not going to have a death penalty and lashes, right? So only the death penalty. If they're both certain, we would only apply the death penalty. But that's because it's two penalties that are associated with the same prohibition. Here, what they're saying is there are different prohibitions. The same action violates different prohibitions. That's why there's multiple sets of lashes, because the same action violated different prohibitions. Now, that doesn't always mean that they're going to apply, 200 lashes. I'm sure they would not. But what they're saying when they say he is flogged with 5 sets of lashes, it's actually shorthand for he violated 5 prohibitions. Sharon, it seems oxymoronic to flog anyone for trying but screwing up a peace offering. Opting to do a voluntary peace offering at all seems praiseworthy as it is optional. Yes, but that you do have to do it right. Again, were people actually flogged? For these kinds of things, they wouldn't screw it up and be flogged, because to be flogged, they would have had to be warned what is the correct law and then do it anyway. Right? So that's where they're intentionally violating the law that they know is the law. They're not screwing it up. But I take your point. Joe, you have taught that a totally or partially blind man is excused from going up to Jerusalem, traveling, because they are required to see and be seen. Is this visually impaired man still required to put away the second tithe, even though he won't benefit from it? Could he face lashes for not putting it aside? Whew! Amazing, awesome question. I don't know what the answer to that is. If he's not obligated in the regalim, right, the pilgrimage festivals, the walking up to Jerusalem, then is he obligated in maaser sheini? Now, in the 3rd and 6th years of the Shemitah cycle, the second tithe is not used for maaser sheini to go up to Jerusalem. Rather, it's the maaser ani, the poor man's tithe. So presumably he would be obligated in that. But in the 1st and 2nd and 4th and 5th years of the cycle, when it would be for maaser sheini, and he's not obligated, does he have to put that aside? And by the way, what do we do with maaser sheini that was put aside and the person never went up to Jerusalem? I guess he could use it in a future year. But this blind person who's not obligated, what does he do with it? And interestingly, what if he decides to go up anyway? Okay, he's not obligated, but he goes. Can he use his maaser sheini? Does it work? Right? If he's not obligated to go, can he still use maaser sheini? These are good questions, and I don't know the answer. And you also said, would he put it aside but share with family priests or the community to assist them during the time in Jerusalem? That seems logical, but I'm not sure if that's the right answer. Would this portion be sold and the money go to the temple for its support? Another, smart and wise outcome, but I'm not sure if it's right or not. Really good question. It really shows that you understand the Talmudic process by asking those questions. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, I'll see you again tomorrow, Friday, at the regular Friday time of noon Pacific. Have a great night.